children in the study, children obviously now elderly, were all alive and present in continental Europe during the Second World War, but they were also so young that they often didn't have clear memories of the experience. So another way to think about it is it's embodied memory. They were there, they lived through it, but it's not coherent memory. They often can't, they've got memory fragments, they can't piece them together, sometimes they really have nothing at all. And I also chose to study children who left Europe after the war, which the majority did of child Holocaust survivors, and never returned. Because I was interested in how people make sense of that past, or that childhood over time. I wanted to start from the assumption that that's even a more complex process if you haven't just lost your home and your community, but you've lost your language and culture as well. So that's the double dislocation. And what I was surprised, actually, I have to admit, because it's such a diverse group, that have 100 kids in here, was how strongly both a very transnational, but also a kind of collective narrative came out. Sorry. And these children are born all over continental Europe. You've got children from Riga and Salonika and Antwerp, and they end up in Seattle and Winnipeg, and probably some in Durham, although not in here. And yet, despite all that, those vast reaches of space and time that stretch between their communities of origin and the places they end up, despite all that, their stories really share a lot of common elements. And I will be interested to hear if you think there are commonalities with the present. The children in this study often moved several times, both during the war and after the war. So they moved within countries, across regions, within regions, sometimes across national borders during the war, especially for a kind of flight into neutral territory. So large numbers of children moved, for example, from France into neutral Switzerland or across the Pyrenees. And you have a lot of this type of movement even during the war. And each move required a new language. And with it, a new identity, sometimes even new names, of course. And this wasn't, the imperative here was survival, right? That you needed to sometimes you need to pass in that new language very, very quickly to survive. Now, children are, of course, adept at learning new languages. But one of the things I noticed in doing the work, and I don't write about this in the book because I think it's something, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a child developmental expert, I'm a historian. So it stood out to me, but I didn't feel that I could write about it, but I do feel I could talk to you about it today. One of the things I noticed is how many of the children had a protracted period of what psychologists would call infantile amnesia, as in I'll explain a little bit about that if you don't know if you've not heard the term. So infantile amnesia, the period of our earliest years we can't remember. No matter what conditions we're raised in, perfectly happy and healthy conditions, it doesn't matter. We tend to have very discontinuous memories of our earlier childhoods, and we tend to have no memories at all before the age of 3. You will sometimes meet people who adamantly believe that they have memories before the age of 3, but experimental psychologists think that they don't. So we'll just accept that maybe we don't have direct access to those earliest memories. The problem, I think, was not the layering on of additional languages. That's something children can do very easily. It was the cutting off of the identity attached to the earlier language. And the end result for many of the children, certainly in this study, was a prolongation of this period of infantile amnesia. So if most of us in the room don't really remember our lives before the age of 3, most of the children in this book don't really remember before the age of 7. So they have a much, much longer period of just not remembering, and that makes that re-piecing together of yourself even all that much harder if there's nobody who can fill in the details.
In this talk, I chose to look at the nexus between language, migration, belonging, and integration, and hoping that there'll be some areas of relevance for the theme today. I'm going to present, rather than presenting one research project, I opted for looking at a kind of, let's say, a medley of research, looking at different areas of different research projects that I've done, and particularly salient points that can help us think about displacement in the Ukrainian context. So it will be a little bit kind of maybe not focused directly on Ukraine. I'll present examples from different areas of research. But the idea is also to open up lines of reflection, lines of dialogue, to think a little bit like what Rebecca did earlier. Are there some parallels? Can we learn from other young people's experiences? And also are there cases where it's very different? We talked about the exceptionality of the Ukrainian conflict and Ukrainian migration. And so I think we need to hold those different things in mind. The other point is my kind of approach to kind of migrant children in general is a very heterogeneous one, so I don't assume that there's any kind of unitary experience, but there might be points of convergence and divergence, so that's something that I wanted to look at as well. Now, what I'm interested as well is in the role of discourses around migration and diversity, and the way in which institutional structures then shape the experience, well, kind of echo some of these discourses, or might try to resist them or negotiate them, and also how this shapes the experiences of social agents such as educators, teachers, and young people. And through that, I'm interested in looking at the dynamics of inclusion and exclusion in school. And in particular here, we're looking at language and belonging, and what are the dynamics of inclusion and exclusion that emerge around language, even with the best kind of policy and integration intentions, that very often there are these tacit and implicit mechanisms that happen. So theoretically, a lot of my work is underpinned by the work of Pierre Bourdieu on language and symbolic power, and the post-colonial critique of language by Frantz Fanon, looking at language and oppression, and how these are articulated not just in a kind of strongly violent way, but also in a symbolically violent way. Now, this is important as well. We're talking about war and violence, and in some cases my research has engaged with young people from who have experienced conflict, but also I take kind of the notion of violence from multiple perspectives. So one approach, for example, building on Pierre Bourdieu, is the notion of symbolic violence. What does it mean to be excluded, to be named and labeled as other, to be positioned as other, in particular within school spaces? There's also, and this might link to some ways with Rebecca's fantastic talk, there's the memory and the history of violence. So a lot of the populations that I've worked with might be considered second generation immigrants, so their parents had to immigrate, a lot of them had to flee violence, or a lot of them are from post-colonial immigration, and for example have experienced colonial wars which might have happened 60, 70 years ago, but are very present in the memory of the families, and as you'll see from some of the examples in the experience of young people. So for example, the Algerian Independence War, or the Indian Partition, for example. So another aspect that came up a lot from research with children and young people was the idea of a very hostile environment. And I'm just going to go back a little bit historically. This was a project that we did looking at the last kind of 15 years of the representation of language difference in the press. Again, I'm pressed for time, so I'm not going to go into all the details, but just to give an example of the kind of rhetorical and lexical strategies that a lot of the press used, and we're talking here about tabloids, but also mid-market and broadsheet press as well. And so a huge kind of rhetorical strategies using very negative lexicon, such as swamped, being flooded, using numerical kind of, strong numerical kind of references to say there's thousands of children who are going to miss out. And the idea that having children who speak a different language is changing the British character of schools in this particular case. And here's a particularly salient example, I think, which from the Telegraph, so a mid-market newspaper. This is over a decade ago, but the title was "If you don't speak English, you can't belong in Britain." And then the subtitle talks about the fact that parents need to be able to read and speak English to help their children progress at school. So creating huge lines of division, and a lot of young people spoke to the fact that this, and very young children, 9, 10 as well, spoke to the fact that this very hostile environment made them feel that they could not speak about their home language, or really had to try very hard to integrate as quickly as possible. So we moved from an idea of inclusion, of celebrating multilingualism, to a very strong assimilationist view as well, which carries hierarchies of which languages are legitimate and which are not. If we're thinking about Ukrainian displacement as well, it raises questions about belonging, integration, and identity in the particular context of protracted displacement, where initially children might have arrived thinking it would be a couple of months, and what's happening now. And we've talked a lot about the uncertainty with relation to housing and hosting, but I think for children that's something, and young people, that's something really important to think in schools as well, in that kind of sense of belonging as well, and what it means in terms of home language. I know there's been a lot of Ukrainian online education, which might counter some of the difficulties that children in this research have had, but there's still something really difficult there, and that links to temporality and uncertainty as well. And I'll just finish on that. I've mentioned many times Young People's Agency, but throughout kind of 15 years of research that's really come out of working with young people is the kind of looking at past, present, future, which is very kind of thematically aligned with what we're doing today, and thinking about this notion of global and local imaginaries, how that plays in for children, how that links to memory, but also how that can link to hope. And if we're thinking about reconstruction, about the future, about reparative futures as well, which are hugely important in terms of these children will be part of this reparation, part of the recognition, and part of the reconstruction. So I'll leave you on those thoughts, but hopefully I just invite dialogue on this and whether these are aligned with the experience of Ukrainian displaced people.
So the impact on our county, so when Homes for Ukraine, when we first discovered sadly that this situation was happening, County Durham, I'm not sure, because we weren't here earlier, I don't know how much has been discussed about numbers, but County Durham residents have been particularly generous in their offer of homes for families coming from Ukraine. And the impact of that was that we did have significant numbers of arrivals that, and in terms of our team, the impact was pretty massive. If we think about they were arriving all over the county. So I mentioned lack of diversity. We had many schools that were receiving children that didn't speak English, that never had a child in their school previously.
I don't know if you know, but our team was sort of set up and in place. It's been set up and in place for years and years. Originally, this team was, any pupil who arrived in County, well, it still is, any pupil who arrives in County Durham and is of school age, our team will sort of provide for and advise the school. So it's traditionally 15 years ago when I first started with the team, there hadn't been the Syrian war, for example, so all the pupils were either university families or a family that just moved over for work, but random really. Then from 2016 it was the Syrian resettlement scheme, and then we've had various resettlement schemes, and including this one as well.
So the impact was pretty big, on many schools. We were inundated with calls for help, and it was really a very dynamic situation. We were just trying to deal with, as everybody was, the situation as it was evolving very quickly. When I say far and wide, we're talking some really remote areas like St John's Chapel. We had suddenly a school that had 10 pupils had 25% of them were now EAL because it had so it was having quite an impact on smaller schools, and we, through consultation with Schools Forum and the local authority, we decided another issue actually was that the DFE announced that there was going to be no funding for families in education arriving through the family scheme, so they wouldn't be funded at all. So we had schools saying, so what support are you going to give to us? And obviously we were going to support them. We were a centralised team that already existed, but like I say, it's operationally I'm trying to explain the impact on us as a team to try and meet those needs.
With high levels of literacy and home language, many of the older secondary pupils came also with some English. This was a contrast for us because the previous groups that we'd had, obviously from Syria and Afghanistan, and some of those pupils had been, especially the Syrians, had been out. Some had never really had much of an education at all because of the war. Some had had some kind of education, ran by volunteers in a school. It was really sort of a mixed bag. But when the Ukrainian children came, it was, it's evident that it was sort of straight out of a very strong system. So we've got some additional funding to keep our bilingual education officer, our Ukrainian speaker, so that's good news. And we're continuing the support, as we've already mentioned. We've got 3 secondary schools in the county who seem to have the highest numbers of Ukrainian pupils, so we kind of focus the support there as necessary, and we're monitoring their emotional well-being as we go along.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
We could immediately observe that those who are displaced within the country, they were overlooked because the main focus was and still is on cross-border migration. And today we also observe this discrepancy because if we look at the publications and numbers of research done to Ukrainian displaced after the full-scale invasion, we see that again much more research is conducted outside of Ukraine with people who are refugees outside than those who are inside of the country. And if we look at what is studied again because quite often it's dictated by the states and state agencies and different types of agencies which have their own interests. The focus is mostly on push factors, structural inequalities, and I'm constantly answering whenever I'm asked to present a question whether Ukrainians will stay, what is the percent of those who will stay, and how many of them, and what are the intentions to return. And when again the literature discusses the migration, and especially when we look at the media and political coverage of the phenomenon. For us, it's also very important to remember that those who were relocated, they were quite often people with very high human capital, and coming or being forced to move from bigger cities quite often to smaller cities or of different parts of Ukraine, including east and south, we don't know, it's very difficult to relate ourselves to the urban spaces which are culturally and symbolically different for us. We don't reach these symbolic images, and not speaking about other countries which are even further culturally for Ukrainians and less permeable.
What are the kind of conditions under which people say, I refuse to be regarded as a refugee?
The attitude, again, if you look at the documents quite often which are produced in US about the integration or in Ukraine, they are seen as the passive recipients. So they have to listen or acquire knowledges or acquire some skills to become part of those communities. But in reality, they don't feel this way. And for me, this is why they refuse to call themselves.
Yeah. If I may add to this, probably, Victoria, you would also agree that this is an emerging agenda inside Ukraine of the tension between the citizens who stayed behind in Ukraine and who left Ukraine. And this is about disputed citizenship, I would say. So those who left the country sometimes are being treated as semi-citizens, not enough citizens. And this is reported as one of the phenomena, one of the social problems that will be a kind of clash in the Ukrainian society in the post-war period. So some of those rejected the term refugee because it means that you are not enough a citizen, something like that.
My name is Hannah Rushtik, and I'm interested in all things cities. So I research cities in different parts of the world, and I'm interested in how do we think about cities that are not really written about or well represented in policy work and in academia. So my book in 2021 was about overlooked cities from many different continents, and we continue to work in this space. And we've also done some magazines around theorizing from overlooked cities in English and in French. And my surname is Polish. My parents are Polish immigrants to the US, and I was born in the United States. And I was working on a digital technology refugee migrant project here at Durham when the Russians invaded Ukraine in 2022. And like everyone, I was sort of thinking, what am I going to do? And so I did different things here in the UK, but I wrote this opinion piece in a journal called Fenia at the end of 2022. And what I wrote was, from listening to Polish people, why did Polish society and government and municipalities respond in the way that they did? And overwhelmingly, people said it's the right thing to do. And there was 4 particular reasons, in my opinion, why Poland responded in the way that it did. And the first, there's a collective intergenerational trauma and fear that Russia will not stop at the Ukrainian border. They don't want to be next or part of this list of countries, and they know what happened in World War II. So I looked in the Oxford Dictionary about the word for displacement. The word for displacement has been around for hundreds of years, but the word for the noun of internal displacement has only been around since the 1940s. So really, I just want to nod to what's happening in Ukraine with the internal displacement, and how is external displacement viewed in comparison to internal displacement. So I think there's something there that's quite interesting. I can speak Polish and I can read Polish. So I've been following the Twitter feeds and the different forms of communication coming out of Poland since the war started. I've been talking to my friends and family members, and then I went last year in March for the first time. So I didn't really want to go do any research that first year. So I went in March of last year and had 37 interviews, 7 different cities, and I met with government officials, with civil society, with the diaspora, and others. And so this is the sign that greets people when they come to Przemysl, which is in the southeastern side, which is the main border crossing with Ukraine. Kutno, where I lived and worked for 2 years, which is a smaller, medium-sized town, they also were supporting Ukrainians. And it continues. Lublin, pray for Ukraine. This is how you can access government services, medical support. The signs are in Ukrainian. This year, I haven't gone back yet. I'm going back next week to Poland. But for this year, for the 2nd anniversary, I was listening to 2 different webinars organized by the Center for Migration Research in Warsaw. They do some really amazing workshops with Ukraine and also in Poland. So they had 2, one in March and one in May of this year, around migration in cities and then regional dimensions of migration. So it was academics organizing it for the local authorities, and they were, of course they were waxing lyrical about the good work that they did, but then they were also like, okay, we didn't do this well, we need to improve on that. And they spoke about the agency of Ukrainians. In Poland, there was movement of people to different places and spaces over time. The speakers from the municipalities, under no circumstances talk about integration. They say we talk about community. So they don't necessarily want to integrate Ukrainians because they don't know who's going to stay for how long and when. And so the framing device that they're using is this act of being a community. The one thing that one of the municipalities said they could have done better was to try to politically integrate Ukrainians into Polish life. So they said their work didn't start in 2022. It started much earlier than that. They said they weren't prepared for the crisis that started on the 24th, the 24th of February. but they knew how to support each other and that the cultural organizations and the volunteers were fundamentally important. The municipalities say that they call Ukrainians new residents. They do things with and not for people. So I'm going to stop my presentation there. Thank you.
Well, I work for humanitarian support team, and our team provides lots of aspects for those who just arrived under the Homes for Ukraine scheme, such as housing, any kind of benefit, I would say child's benefit, universal credit, pension credit, also housing. Sometimes when people arrive under the sponsorship, it's not always a good match. Sometimes it could be some misunderstanding. And there are two options. The first one is finding a new sponsor, which is called rematch. The second one is the housing process, which includes finding a social or a private rent and providing the Ukrainians with different funds such as welfare assistance, and other includes providing them with white goods, furniture and stuff like that. Honestly, the program started in March, and Durham County Council did not have at that moment a special staff who could help, who could go for a visit and help people to be settled. So that's why this community really helped us with registering in NHS, helping our children with the schools, nurseries, and other important things. And people of Shatvoth also helped not only our families who stayed in Shatvoth, but their families who stayed in Ukraine. So on the second picture is my sponsor, and we collected some boxes, some for the army and some for our families, because it was very difficult while blackout and while some families really were struggling without basic things. And I would like to tell about one person in particular. His name is Chris Turner, and he's from Shatvoth as well. With the help of his wife and community of Shatvoth, he managed to bring here over 40 families from Ukraine. He helped them on the stage like how to apply for visa, how to bring them, how to explain, how to help, how to get the SIM card, and lots of very important things. And in autumn 2022, United Reformed Church kindly agreed to provide us a hall in church in Waddington Street. And since then, our meetings are still on. So we have a great possibility to meet every Saturday. We hold lots of events such as our, like in best Ukrainian traditions, where we can share our food, probably some clothes, and we organize some events for our children. And recently, the students from Durham University voluntarily agreed to provide some additional classes for our teenagers for maths and languages. And there is also a dance club where you can improve your dancing skills, which is very good for Ukrainians to meet again. Even if it is once a week, it's still nice. When people started to arrive, New College Durham and Durham Law organized ESOL classes for everyone, mostly for Durham area, but also for Spennymoor, Bishop Auckland and CM. Because some people arrived with a good language, some of them arrived with basic English, and some of them arrived, unfortunately, with zero language. And I think it's one of the problems why it became the first issue to find the job. As sometimes people could write, could read, could translate, but unfortunately not everyone could translate and could speak easily. And lots of jobs, the interview for lots of jobs requires very good speaking skills. And yeah, of course, there are lots of people who prefer to stay here
and to be on universal credit. But it's not just the reason because people are lazy, just because of limited childcare. People who have 1, 2 or 3 children, they cannot allow to go and find even part-time job because simply prefer to find someone for the full-time. Another problem, which is on the second place, I think, is a teenager problem. We have faced loss of families. For example, when children under the age like 13 plus, they can't find themselves here. And they're saying it's like, oh, in Ukraine we have nearly everything, but here it's really impossible to find friends. And they just close off everyone and persuading the parents, oh, we need to go back, or I will not go to school. So it's really a big problem for the families when mom realizes that she cannot take him home, him or her, and but the teenagers saying that I can't bear it anymore. And the next problem why people started to go back home is their families who stayed in Ukraine. Some of them have their children, adult children, parents, husbands, and it's really difficult to manage here without your family. And it's really impossible, nearly impossible, to bring someone here under the touristic visa or any other schemes, such as family scheme or extension scheme. So that's why it's really an issue at the moment. As because after some changes in the government, in the system, under the Homes for Ukraine, that after the 16th of February, you are not allowed to be, for Ukrainians, you are not allowed to be a sponsor anymore. So that means you cannot help your family to flee from the war. When we joined Homes for Ukraine, no one of us expected to stay here for a long time. And we all thought that we would go back home like in a few months. But unfortunately, the war is still on and it was extended. But time passes and we found out that our children went to school with outstanding results in language. And just because of visa issue, BRP issue, we really don't know what happens next and what we should do next. And really it's kind of burning question, what to do, what kind of decision will government issue. But the only way is to wait and believe. And just want to say that as every Ukrainian family, we would like to contribute the country which gave us a shelter in this difficult 2022. We do not want to sit here only on benefits. God says, UK, Slava Ukraini. Thank you very much.
My name is Chrysostomos. Please do call me Tommy Apostolidis. And I'm honored to chair this session that reaches across the other side of the pond. So we have actually 2 excellent academics from the other side of the Atlantic joining us for the presentation. So we're going to have Emily Channel Justice talking to us about displacement, taking a more long-term perspective, so looking at the 10-year displacement in Ukraine. And Natalia Haneva-Friesen, who is going to be discussing from displacement to displacement, looking at the 2022 Ukrainian migration.
Thinking about the long-term experience of displacement and how Ukrainian policy could be improved. And of course, much of that framework has changed since 2022.
Since March 2022, over 221,000 flag holders had arrived in Canada, seeking safety and stability for their families.
So this project starts with some of the deterrent policies that the current government have put in place, as well as some of that rhetoric that's been building over the last decade or so. Specifically this narrative about stop the boats. So we wanted to try and change how people are talking about policies towards migration and how people arrive in the UK by shifting away from these very negative views and thinking more of what we can do to facilitate safe pathways. The argument being that if there are more opportunities for safe pathways to enter the UK, then less people would resort to dangerous journeys. So since this stop the boat rhetoric has been proliferated, there have been a lot of negative effects within the UK. So, people dropping out of support services, reports of people when they get to 18 years old, worrying about being shipped off to Rwanda, just disappear. And then obviously being a 17-year-old that's in a sort of underground society, high level of vulnerability. Also stories about people taking different longer journeys across the channel, which obviously is much more dangerous. So we're trying to challenge this policy and say there's a better way forward by facilitating safe pathways. So the problem with deterrent approaches, obviously it doesn't do anything to address the lack of safe routes to the UK. So for our safe pathways policy, we're building on some existing examples. So we've looked internationally, like the sponsorship program in Canada, humanitarian parole in the US, also the West Balkan policies in Germany. We're looking there for examples. And specifically in the UK, building on some of the existing schemes, but we want to make it a bit more universal. So obviously I've only mentioned Afghanistan and Ukraine here. We have looked at the Hong Kong BNO scheme as well. The UK resettlement scheme, mandate scheme, family reunion, they all exist. But I think the primary ones that have sort of caught the attention are Afghanistan and Ukraine. So obviously we can see there's a big difference between how these were implemented, showing the stark sort of disparities between how different migrants are treated or seen as being deserving or worthy of a safe pathway. This is kind of the stages in the policy development. So we've started with policy options. So a lot of organisations have written reports about what they think is important for a safe pathways policy. So we don't want to just, add another report into that mix. So we're at this stage here thinking about policy objectives and options for implementation. We hope to develop the research further. The funding is just until the end of July, so more agency in terms of matching. So I think we see this in the Canadian programs, that there's a lot more. You can sort of nominate, whereas in the UK system, there's no way to nominate somebody. You just get matched with somebody, from what I understand. So also community groups feel that they don't know anything until welcome. They don't know, they just get presented with someone. They're like, who is this person? Where have they come from? What have they experienced before getting here? What was their journey to this point? We're just getting to know this person. And they feel that if there was more people with lived experience involved in those community sponsorship groups, there'd be a better understanding about what needs need to be fulfilled. We also discussed levelling up of communities to be better placed to support. So an example that was raised was actually a community group in Durham said that they welcomed a Muslim person who, and in their community there were no halal shops. So it wasn't ideal environment. This is kind of things that need to be thought about and prepared to be able to allow people sufficient access to cultural life. And then also sort of touched a bit on communities of refugees for refugees. And I think part of that would be sort of moving to the kind of family reunion aspect. So part of another important thing is building infrastructure to keep that knowledge, keep experts in place. I think it was really great to hear the Durham County Council talk about their EFL provision, and that's a good example. That was something that was already in place, and they just had to adapt to meet some slightly new demands. They weren't building from the ground up. They have a system, and they're the sorts of systems and infrastructure we need to build into government, local authorities, communities, so we can rapidly respond to new crises, new groups of people, different demands. However, when it comes to something like migration, it's very difficult to quantify the impact of a policy, which means basically they can say anything they want. So a good example of that is that the UK is one of the only European countries that do not allow children to sponsor their parents. The justification given is that they think that will make people send children on dangerous journeys. However, quite a lot of research has been done which would suggest that wouldn't happen. But because you can't just say, here's a graph that shows it, they just do what they want. So I think building consensus, bringing together all the work that's been done will help give some weight to the proposal. And then we'll move on to thinking about concrete policy options. I think that was my last slide. Yes.
So I'm going to try and draw, throughout this presentation, I'll try and draw on some of the things that everybody else has been talking about, try to contextualise this a little bit. I know we're coming to the end of the day, so everybody's probably a little bit tired. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the Sanctuary Programme, our team, our strategic priorities and cross-sector collaborations and partnerships. I'm sure many of us are really aware that partnerships are essential to supporting people. That's come up time and time again throughout today. Okay, so the King's Sanctuary Programme was formed in 2015 in response to global issues of forced displacement. So I know a few times, was it Peter? Is that your name? Yeah, I think you brought up 2015 and how people responded or didn't respond to that. And this was a response to that. So in 2015, this was set up. And it was a very small scale. So now we've built up and now we have an established team. So since 2022, we've had an established team in place. And the idea of the King's Sanctuary Programme is to connect research, education and social impact to co-create knowledge with purpose in response to the global issue of forced displacement. And that's through creating positive opportunities for people from forced displacement backgrounds, both academics and students alike. It's also about collaborating across the HE sector to develop proactive and sustainable frameworks to support people seeking sanctuary. We know that sanctuary and people who are basically forcibly displaced, this is an ever-growing issue. This is going to increase. So how we build and respond to this in a scalable, replicable way, is really important. So we have key areas of focus. So I know I'm kind of zooming through this, but I've got quite a lot to get through, and these are key areas of focus. So the first one is access to higher education and support to thrive. So that's King's students and academics alike. It's also about education-led pathways and university sponsorship. And it's also about tackling the hostile environment in the higher education sector. UCAS has recently, I don't know how much of you are aware of UCAS provisions, but UCAS has recently they've indicated that people can tick a box, basically say their nationality, and then if they are forcibly displaced, so if they identify somebody who's from a forced migrant background. We don't have this data across the board, across the higher education sector, but I can comment on what it looks like at King's. So at King's, 404 students from a Ukrainian background applied to study at King's this year, so undergraduate level. 35% of those students, those Ukrainian nationals, indicated that they were from a forced migratory background. The second challenge is that basically people who are forcibly displaced don't have access to safe pathways. So that's a project that Jonathan's working on. So it's about creating a sector-leading higher education-led safe pathway that's shaping migration policy, underpinned by research and developed through building local, national and international partnerships. So replicating how a safe pathway works, so the Homes to Ukraine scheme, for example, and implementing it at the university level. So how can universities respond to issues of forced displacement? How can universities ensure that people have access to safe pathways to sanctuary? And then the final challenge is that King's research demonstrates that the detrimental impact of the hostile environment on access to higher education, mental and physical health services and legal support. So the King's response to this is that tackling the hostile environment in the higher education sector and beyond is done so by bringing together academics, civil society, government and sanctuary seekers to co-create and produce research and shape migration policy and practice. Now the wow at the bottom, that's ways of working. So how we kind of respond to all of these things is bringing together education, research and social impact. So I said earlier that we're a research-led department. Listening to and working with affected communities, cross-sector collaboration and sharing knowledge and resources. So matching takes place interactively via phone call or Microsoft Teams to ensure as far as is possible that mutual expectations are aligned and people will get on. And translators were made available to support these calls if needed. And then from there, if both hosts and guests are happy to proceed, they are supported through the visa application process, and other pre-arrival arrangements are made by teams from the host universities. So that's throughout our partnerships. So this can be kind of divided into three main areas. So the recruitment and training of hosts. So hosts were kind of discuss about what it means to be a host, what the expectation is, and the importance of boundaries surrounding hosting, and to make clear what the expectations are with the guest as well. So it's making sure that everybody is on the same page, they understand the implications of being hosted and the limitations of that too. The matching then happens, and pre-arrival support is provided to both the guest and the host. Now then, that doesn't always happen. So if, for example, we work with an academic who doesn't come through the hosting process, we would work with them via CARA or the BA Researchers at Risk programme. So how this works in terms of our partnership is we work in collaboration with CARA to find eligible candidates. The academic then identifies potential supervisors at King's or amongst the partnership. So we make very clear that we have this partnership in place so that the potential colleague can find the most suitable academic fit. We also assign them with a dedicated King's volunteer, and then they are provided with wellbeing support, academic support to build their kind of academic profile and their journey, facilitate networking opportunities and community engagement activities as well. Now then, obviously this sounds great on paper, but when we're going through this process of evaluating how and whether this has actually been achieved and where we need to go to next, and at the moment we are conducting numerous projects, but one project that we're conducting in collaboration with an undergraduate student from a forced displacement background. So CURF means King's Undergraduate Research Fellowship.
Thank you very much.
Peter is a Professor Emeritus of Economic History at the University of Manchester and primarily an expert in the history of population displacement, though obviously he's worked on various aspects of economic, social, and cultural history of modern Europe, led a number of research projects.
But what I wanted to do was to try and answer the following question: how will historians in the future write the history of contemporary Ukrainian displacement? What horizons will they explore? I want to consider what approaches and methods future historians might adopt and what sources might be available to them in the light of current scholarship in refugee history. I anticipate that the future historiography of mass displacement will begin with the origins and course of the conflict and will require close consideration of domestic politics and geopolitics, and ideally pay close attention to the deep history of Ukraine and its relations with its most important neighbours, Russia and Poland, in times of peace and war. But his much quoted statement is, it seems to me, incomplete because it doesn't allow for the wars of displacement fought not on the battlefield, but in places of transit, in the refugee camp, and across the desks of those who determine refugees' eligibility. There will be battles to fight over who are the custodians of the memory of displacement and whether such memories will be forced into a collective Procrustean narrative bed. Lastly, it will be necessary to keep in mind the bigger picture, the significance of other sites and protracted situations, and what these might say about the particularities and commonalities of contemporary Ukrainian displacement, about the policy responses that it has evoked, and about the reception of refugees in host societies, including the UK. I would hope to see historical accounts that interrogate what has happened in Ukraine, but that also accommodate and compare the experiences, including the persecution of other refugees in and beyond Europe, and the policy outcomes that were fashioned. In relation to policy, unfortunately, there are no signs at present that Ukrainian displacement has shifted the dial of the international refugee regime. it seems fitting to end with stories of displacement. The novelist Claire Massoud speaks of the impulse to share one's stories. I've already indicated that most refugees are required to recount their experiences as part of the inevitably intrusive process of claiming recognition. This is a very particular kind of impulse imposed from without. The vulnerability of many refugees is compounded by their exposure to external scrutiny and the depressing realization that those in power over them are rarely held accountable. Massoud is, however, making a broader point. She writes, this impulse to share may stem from multiple sources, but chief among them is surely the comfort of that recognition, the hope and reassurance that each of us is not alone on the planet, that our experiences overlap and can be shared, that we can both bear witness to our own lives and the lives of others, and also, as importantly, that this witness can be shared. I like this statement very much, with its emphasis on bearing witness, and I hope that my paper and the other papers presented at this conference will go some way towards reminding us that scholars, including historians, are also witnesses. Thank you.